Now let's look at the value propositions of Essence. I'm going to look briefly at them through the perspective of three personas: team, the coach, and the executive. Now, this is just a small set of the total number of use cases or value propositions of Essence, but they're some of the ones that we think are most interesting and most compelling. Let's start with the team. So there's three that we want to highlight for the team. First is how Essence helps you learn and understand your practices well. That sounds quite basic. Surely you just give somebody a description of a practice, ask them to read it, and then once they start using it, it will all sink in and everything will be fine. That sounds plausible, but it's not what we see in practice. In practice, especially with development teams, focusing on their way of working isn't always their top priority, especially if the way of working depends upon them thinking a little bit differently. So for example, if you're working in an agile team, you probably have some form of retrospective. How well do they run? How often could you let any member of the team facilitate a retrospective and get really good results? Do you get really good results even from the Scrum Master or the Agile coach facilitating the retrospective? In our experience, even something as easy to describe as a retrospective can be very hard to do well. What Essence does is it breaks a practice down into lots of different elements. And if we look at the Essence standard later on, you'll see what those elements are. What it means is it enables you to focus on understanding what each element is for. So for example, if I take something like a retrospective, I can start to understand who should be there, the purpose of the retrospective, what's the result, results and improvements that we want to see implemented, but I can also look at its connection to other parts of the practice. So in the example of Scrum, I've already mentioned there's an improvement. Well, that's a different part of Scrum. So I need to see improvements be created as a result of my retrospective. I need to have inputs to my retrospective. So I can see the connections between different parts of a practice. And because I can focus on a single thing, that brings in the concept of serious games. We can talk more about serious games later, but serious games are a much more effective way to get people understanding a practice because they're about engagement and collaboration and iteration. You get far better decisions and you get far stronger engagement. So when we bring Essence into a team and we use serious games and the Essence language to help explain the practices a team is to employ, those practices sink in faster. And once they use the practices, again, if we're using a tool like TeamSpace, we keep reinforcing the purpose of each of those elements. So I can see what a sprint retrospective is about every time I do it. I'm not relying on my memory, especially with something as rigorous as Scrum and complex. And that's even before you start to look at more complicated things. Even remembering all the bits of Scrum is quite hard for people. And typically people go and do a training course, they don't remember all the details. Essence and TeamSpace help remind you of those details. The second part then, once I've understood my practice, maybe it's not quite right for me. Maybe I want to do some changes. I might have some extra things that matter to me, maybe some extra internal aspects like different meetings I go to or different ways I report. Well, I can customize and I can tailor my practice, but I can do that in a safe way because I'm using the same language to describe the changes that I use to describe the language, and I can connect them together. I can see how things relate. It means that I'm not customizing things I don't need to, and it means that I can see the impact of any customization or tailoring that I make. So even if I'm not an experienced methodologist, Essence makes it easier for me to make tweaks and tailorings and customizations to how I work in a relatively safe and coherent way. And the final thing is about excelling at practices. We all know that teams should be applying continuous improvement, but how often do teams apply continuous improvement to the way that they work? The answer, not often enough. So Essence allows you a much easier way to integrate continuous improvement of your way of working to your team. Alongside that, we also know that when we're in a more complex world, we've got complex adaptive systems, we're dealing with change, it might be the case that the right mix of practices and customizations that were right for me last month aren't correct this month. So I need to be able to do that inspection and adaptation and continuous improvement to make sure that I'm still choosing the right set of practices that I was last time. And I recognize when a practice is becoming less effective for the situation that I'm employing it in. So that brings that together, because actually doing that continuous improvement brings us back to the learning and understanding, because in doing so, I'm learning and understanding the practices that I'm using more strongly. So we've got a nice little feedback loop with the team. Let's think for a second about the coach. So everything I've just talked about is about helping the team understand their way of working. Now, if you think about lots of teams today, it's very often the case that the team isn't thinking much about their way of working at all. If they're lucky, they've got somebody around the team, a coach or a team lead or a development manager or a scrum master or a release train engineer, and he or she is thinking about the team's way of working and they're telling the team what to do. And left to their own devices, often teams like to be told what to do. Doesn't get the best results out of people. We know from Dan Pink's work on intrinsic motivation, autonomy, mastery, and purpose will get intrinsic motivation dialed up and teams will become more effective. They'll be more effective at how they work and they'll spot problems and changes faster. We don't want teams to be told what to do by a scrum master. So Essence helps teams help themselves, so they understand for themselves how they work. That lets the coach more effectively, either elsewhere, so they have less time needing to keep the team on track. They can spend time coaching others. So for example, in Scrum, the Scrum Master's responsibility is to coach the product owner and the organization just as much as it is to coach the team. Many Scrum Masters spend a lot of their time consumed with the team, and they don't have the time to coach the organization to interact with the team better or to coach the product owner to help the team better. So by having the team help themselves, it allows the coach to elevate their coaching. And even with the team, they can coach more effectively with the team because they're not constantly reminding the team of the basics of the practice. And finally, just as it's easier to learn practices with Essence, so too it's easier to teach practices. Often we find team leads are in a teaching role sometimes, and especially if we've got internal practices, things that are evolved from within an organization, if we create those in Essence practices, and as you'll see in the authoring section, if you watch that, that's not a difficult thing, then you've also unlocked a whole range of easier ways to teach a practice to a team. And finally, the organization. Now, clearly having coaches that are more effective and teams that are more effective are benefits to the organization. So let's look at some different complementary benefits that we can see from Essence at an organization or an executive level. The first one is about balancing autonomy and alignment. There's a natural tension, especially with organizations that want to work in an agile way, between a team desire for autonomy and the ability to choose their own practices, have agency and autonomy over how they work, with an organization's desire to have all teams, or at least similar teams, working in a similar way, or sometimes an identical way, but also the need an organization has for metadata, for reporting information, for management information. And it's easy for organizations to move too far towards the alignment and the control by forcing teams to work in a certain way. Essence allows you to do that in a smarter way, a different way, by focusing on reporting the right things and not necessarily having all teams do it in the same way. So for example, we talk in other videos about measuring progress and using state to measure progress. Well, if I look at state as a measure of progress, how I get to that state doesn't really matter. If I happen to use Kanban or Scrum, it doesn't really matter as long as I report my progress in a similar way. So it allows organizations to optimize the reporting channels and separate them, decouple them from the detail of how teams work. That allows the teams to have more autonomy over how they work, and sometimes even things like cadences, because they've got the boundaries set a bit clearer. So Essence makes that easy, and the way it does that is because of this independence and agnostic behavior it has. So Essence doesn't depend upon particular practices, because the kernel and the standard allows us to present a common ground and use that as part of our ability to align teams together. Many organizations have a demand for high quality. And in many forms of engineering, the engineering discipline has evolved to be almost certain of quality if you follow certain standards. Software engineering is lagged behind to some extent. So it's still a discipline that is almost regarded largely as a craft. It's esoteric. It's got talent, people using talent to get by rather than structure and rigor. And whilst we're not saying that we should make software engineering something as prescriptive as, say, structural engineering or mechanical engineering, or as scientific as, say, physics, there's a direction that software can move in that will allow it to become much more effective and much more and increase the quality to a large degree. And Essence helps you do that because of its focus on practices. So identifying the practices you want to bring into your software engineering discipline allows that then to be forming a framework and a foundation for teams to follow. It doesn't stop people being creative and innovative and bringing high talent to having tremendous ideas, but it does mean that you've got the basics sorted. And those basics might be just simple things around test, continuous deployment, around the traceability of requirements, or they might be a fully fledged detailed practice about exactly how you implement a certain thing, which might be important in a safety critical application or in highly regulated environments. So it's an interesting kind of, in fact, it's one of what Ivar talks about as the killer use cases that Essence brings, is by choosing the right practices, a massive change in the quality of the output of your teams and the move of software from being more of a craft to being more of a discipline. And the final part is alluded to earlier around cultural change. So we'll talk more about this when we think about transformation, but the culture of an organization is driven by its mindset and habits and behaviors. Designing practices well allows you to design and choose what those habits, mindsets, and behaviors will be when people apply those practices well. Bring in the attribute of Essence to help people apply practices well, and you can see that we can get that connection between the desired values and principles through the implementation of the practices to the habits and behaviors and mindset of the people in the teams, and we can get that cultural change kind of implemented through the way that we work, because that's what culture really is: how people work, how they think, how they approach things. Essence helps you do all those things in a more controlled way because you've made some choices within your practice design about how that works. There's a lot more we can talk about that in the transformation side. From an organization's point of view, it's an interesting use case because it's easy to say the culture we want. It's a bit harder to say how do we get there. Essence provides a really good way to get there in practical terms. So that's a relatively brief but still quite detailed skim through these 9 critical use cases or value propositions of Essence for an organization, for its leaders and coaches, and for the teams within it.